Did you know when you file a joint tax return with your spouse, you're both responsible for the entire tax bill, even if your spouse earned all the income or made all the tax decisions? I'm Andrew Bosserman, tax attorney and founder of Boss Tax Law, and in this video, I'm going to discuss how you can deal with issues involving joint liability by utilizing a few relief options, often known as innocent spouse. If you file a joint tax return, that means that you're joint and severally liable with your spouse for any taxes owed. That means, for example, if you owe $10,000 to the IRS, can either come after you for all $10,000 or your spouse for all $10,000 or some apportionment between each of you. Generally, they often try to collect from the person who has the deepest pockets. But what happens when, say, your spouse hides income, claims deductions you knew nothing about, or just doesn't pay taxes owed, say, related to their business? Fortunately, the IRS offers several types of relief, often called innocent spouse relief, that might help you escape liability for your spouse's tax problems. So in this video today, I'm going to quickly go over 4 key options. So there's the traditional innocent spouse relief, there's separation of liability relief, there's equitable relief, and there's injured spouse relief. And by the end of this video, I hope you have an idea of what option might apply best to your situation. So first, let's talk about traditional innocent spouse relief. This is found in Internal Revenue Code section 6015B. This is best used in situations where your spouse either understated income or overstated deductions on your tax return and you had no idea about it. So to qualify, you have to meet 5 requirements. First, that a joint tax return was filed. 2, that there was an understatement of tax, and generally this is discovered through either an IRS audit or some other underreporting assessment made by the IRS. Number 3 is that the other individual, so say yourself, if your spouse is the one that the understatement is due to, you did not know or didn't have any reason to know of the understatement. And this is really the critical point. If your spouse does something you can't have actually known, but you also couldn't have, say, constructive knowledge, reason to know. This often refers to things like a big increase in the standard of living, in your standard of living. Maybe you should have known that there was more income coming in. Things like that, reasons to know. Number 4, it would be unfair to hold the other spouse liable for the deficiency. And 5, you must file for innocent spouse protection within 2 years after IRS collection activity begins. Like I said, really the key here is that knowledge requirement. If you should have known something was wrong, then you probably won't qualify. The IRS will also look at your education, your business experience, your involvement in the family tax and finances to see if maybe you should have known. And also, you definitely have to make sure to file within that 2-year period to qualify. So that's traditional innocent spouse relief. Let's now talk about separation of liability. And this is found in IRC 6015C. This option is available if you're divorced, legally separated, or haven't lived with your spouse for at least 12 months. So traditional innocent spouse, you can still be married to qualify for it, but under separation of liability, you have to be either divorced, separated, or haven't lived with your spouse for at least 12 months. So when you file for separation of liability relief, what happens is if you qualify, the IRS allocates the deficiency between you and your spouse based on what each person should have reported and what each person owes. So essentially, you'll only be responsible for your portion, so the tax related to your portion of the income. However, in order to qualify for this protection, you must prove to the IRS that you did not have actual knowledge of the items that led to this understatement. So this burden you have to prove is a lot easier than the traditional innocent spouse. The IRS must prove you have actual knowledge, whereas for traditional innocent spouse, it's just that you should have known qualifies. So it's a much higher standard and harder for the IRS to prove. So long as you didn't have actual knowledge of the issues that led to the understatement of tax, then you may qualify for separation of liability relief. Next, let's talk about equitable relief. So equitable relief, and this is found in IRC 6015F, this is your backup catch-all option when you don't qualify for either traditional innocent spouse or separation of liability. The other key thing to note is that the first two options I talked about are only available for understatements of tax. So that means you understate the tax on your return and the IRS comes back and says, hey, you owe more money through an assessment. But equitable relief is available for understatements, but also underpayments of tax, meaning we reported all the tax on our return that was due, but we just didn't pay it. And you can get relief for that through equitable relief. So this is really a facts and circumstances based relief option. So the IRS is going to look at all sorts of different factors, whether you received a benefit from the unpaid taxes, your current financial situation. They can consider any sort of abuse or domestic violence. And also, did you make a good faith effort to comply with the tax laws? So, well, this is the most flexible backup option. It's also unpredictable because each case is decided on the individual facts and circumstances, but it's definitely worth applying for if you think you may qualify. And the final option is a little different, but this is called injured spouse relief. So this isn't about escaping liability for the taxes, but this is about getting your refund back when the IRS takes it to pay your spouse's separate debts. So oftentimes I've seen this when a spouse brings in a tax debt into a marriage that they incurred prior to marriage. If you start filing jointly and your spouse owes money, oftentimes the IRS will take that refund to pay your spouse's back taxes, even if some of that refund may be due to taxes that you overpaid. If that happens, you can request injured spouse relief and you can get your portion of the refund attributable to you back. And then only the portion of the refund that your spouse is entitled to, that will get going to his or her tax debt. So this is really just about recovering money that's rightfully yours. You're not avoiding any tax liability. So how do we request these types of relief? So for all innocent spouse relief types, except for injured spouse, you're going to file Form 8857. And for injured spouse, you're going to file Form 8379. You generally have, for the innocent spouse reliefs, you generally have 2 years from when the IRS first tries to collect from you. Equitable relief can sometimes be extended a little more, but you generally want to file for this type of relief as soon as possible. This has been an overview of the different innocent spouse provisions to avoid a joint liability for taxes. Oftentimes, the situations can be very complex, they're very fact-specific, and the stakes are often high, especially if maybe your spouse was the sole breadwinner, handled all the taxes, but now you're facing a potentially massive tax bill. So if you're facing one of these types of cases, you definitely want to consult with a tax professional to see what works best for you and who has handled innocent spouse cases before. So remember, you have rights as a taxpayer, even if the IRS is saying you're responsible for this debt on a joint return. There are these innocent spouse relief provisions, so you don't have to suffer financially because your spouse made mistakes. Understanding these options and how they work are very powerful to getting you out of unfavorable tax situation when you didn't know about it at all. So if you're wondering more about the innocent spouse relief options or want help involving analyzing your situation to see if you might qualify, please reach out. I'd be happy to help or point you in the right direction.